Millionaire spoiled his mistress in first class until his pregnant wife walked on board as the airline CEO. Before Aurelia Flight 701 leaves New York, Preston Caldwell will discover that the pregnant wife he dismissed as ordinary is the CEO of the airline carrying him to London. As you listen, decide what you would value most after a betrayal like this: truth, accountability, or the possibility of a second chance, and share your view in the comments. This story is fictional and created for entertainment. All characters, companies, events, and situations are invented and are not intended to represent real people or organizations. The champagne cork burst with a crisp pop across the first-class cabin, turning several heads before the glasses had even been filled. Crystal glasses chimed. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers. Outside the oval windows, the late afternoon sun painted the clouds in streaks of gold, making Aurelia Flight 701 to London feel less like commercial travel and more like an exclusive private club reserved for people who believed money could erase consequences. Preston Caldwell certainly believed that. At 38, the real estate millionaire leaned comfortably into his wide leather seat, the confidence of a man accustomed to buying admiration wherever he traveled. His charcoal Italian suit fit perfectly. A platinum watch gleamed beneath the cabin lights. Every movement suggested absolute certainty that the world revolved around him. Beside him sat Vanessa Locke. Young, elegant, beautiful in the polished, magazine cover way that attracted every wandering glance in the cabin. She laughed as Preston lifted a velvet jewelry box from his carry-on. "I thought London deserved something memorable," he said. The diamond bracelet sparkled before she even touched it. "Oh my God." Vanessa covered her mouth dramatically while several nearby passengers looked over with discreet curiosity. "For me? For who else?" He smiled, fastening the bracelet around her wrist with deliberate care. "It suits the future, Mrs. Caldwell." Vanessa giggled loud enough for 3 rows to hear. "You still know how to spoil me." A businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper, noticed the performance, and quietly returned to his page. Nobody interrupted. Luxury had a strange way of convincing strangers to ignore uncomfortable things. Vanessa admired the diamonds beneath the reading light before asking the question that sounded playful but carried poison beneath every syllable. "What about your wife?" Preston didn't hesitate. "Caroline." He laughed softly, swirling the champagne inside his crystal flute. "She's probably home reading parenting books." Another laugh. "Pregnancy changed everything." Vanessa tilted her head. "Doesn't she ever wonder where you are?" "She stopped asking months ago." His voice carried the calm arrogance of someone who believed silence meant surrender. Besides, he leaned closer. "She'd never belong somewhere like this." Vanessa smirked. "Poor thing. She's sweet." Preston shrugged. "But she's ordinary." He glanced around the luxurious cabin. "Some women are simply born to admire success." His fingers brushed Vanessa's cheek. "And others deserve to enjoy it." Neither of them noticed several passengers exchanging uncomfortable looks. The elderly woman sitting 2 rows behind quietly folded the novel she had been reading. The young flight attendant serving drinks forced herself to maintain a professional smile, though something about the conversation made her stomach tighten. She recognized the passenger list. She also recognized the name of the executive review passenger scheduled to board during the final boarding window. A message from the gate confirmed that Caroline Whitmore had reached the jet bridge exactly as planned. The chief purser checked the time, exchanged a brief nod with the gate agent, and picked up the cabin microphone. Seconds later, the speakers crackled gently to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," her calm voice floated through the aircraft. "Before our departure, it is my distinct honor to welcome a very special guest aboard today's flight." Several passengers looked around curiously. Vanessa barely glanced up. Preston continued sipping champagne. She continued, "Please join us in welcoming the Chief Executive Officer of Aurelia Atlantic Airways." A strange silence spread through first class. Even the flight attendants straightened instinctively. The boarding door opened with a soft mechanical hiss. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. Elegant. Every pair of eyes turned toward the entrance. A blonde woman appeared beneath the warm cabin lights. She was 29 weeks pregnant, and her obstetrician had cleared the uncomplicated trip. She wore an ivory coat over a simple maternity dress. One hand rested gently against the curve of her belly. The other carried nothing except quiet confidence. Pinned near her collar was a small gold-and-white wing insignia. The moment the chief purser saw it, she smiled. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Whitmore." The two senior attendants nearest the door straightened warmly, while the rest of the crew continued their normal boarding duties. Preston slowly lowered his champagne glass. His smile faded. Vanessa blinked in confusion. Neither of them spoke, because standing at the entrance of the aircraft was Caroline Whitmore, his pregnant wife. For 3 long seconds, nobody in first class moved. The champagne bubbles continued rising inside Preston Caldwell's crystal glass. The engines hummed beneath the cabin floor. Somewhere in the back of the aircraft, a child laughed. Everything else had stopped. Caroline Whitmore stood quietly at the entrance, one hand resting protectively against the gentle curve of her 29-week pregnancy. She wore no diamonds, no designer logo large enough to demand attention, no unnecessary display of wealth. The ivory maternity coat draped softly over her shoulders, while the small gold-and-white wing pin near her collar caught the cabin lights for only a heartbeat. It was enough. The recognition in the chief purser's voice had already changed the atmosphere. Vanessa looked from the flight attendants to Caroline, then back to Preston. What did she just say? Preston frowned. His wife? CEO? It made no sense. Caroline had never talked about running an airline. She rarely even talked about work. For years, Preston believed she was simply a quiet consultant who occasionally attended aviation conferences. She never corrected him. He had never asked enough questions to deserve the truth. 2 years earlier, when they first met at a charity gala supporting scholarships for young pilots, Caroline introduced herself with a warm smile. "I work in aviation." That was all she said. Preston assumed she worked somewhere in administration, perhaps human resources, maybe marketing. He remembered feeling almost relieved. A woman with a simple career would never compete with his ambition. Their relationship moved quickly after that. She never flashed expensive jewelry, never talked about business magazines, never bragged about board meetings. When Preston boasted about another profitable property acquisition, Caroline simply smiled and asked whether he had remembered to call his mother on her birthday. He mistook kindness for weakness, silence for dependence, grace for submission. Even after their wedding, Caroline kept one rule she never explained. Business stayed at the office. Home stayed at home. She refused interviews about her private life. She declined invitations to appear beside politicians and celebrities. She traveled alone whenever company matters required discretion. Every decision protected 2 things she valued more than headlines: her marriage and the thousands of employees who depended on Aurelia Atlantic Airways. Meanwhile, Preston built an entirely different story inside his own mind. He convinced himself that Caroline lived comfortably because of him, that his money paid for their home. His reputation opened every door. His success defined their future. As Caroline's pregnancy progressed, something inside him changed. Or perhaps something finally revealed itself. Business dinners became excuses. Weekend meetings multiplied. Phone calls moved outside. He stopped touching her hand during conversations. Stopped asking how the baby was doing. Stopped pretending. Instead, another woman slowly occupied the empty spaces inside his schedule. Vanessa, young, exciting, always impressed by luxury. She admired every expensive watch, every first-class seat, every bottle of vintage champagne, everything Preston desperately wanted the world to notice. Caroline had noticed the distance long before she knew the reason. She did not hire investigators or search Preston's phone. The truth arrived through a far more ordinary channel. 2 days before the flight, Aurelia's ethics office sent her a conflict of interest reminder involving Caldwell Property Group, Preston's company. His firm had submitted a proposal to operate 2 new airport hotels at terminals served by Aurelia. Because the bidder was controlled by the CEO's husband, the board had already placed Caroline behind a formal recusal wall. She would not score the proposal, speak to evaluators, or approve the commercial decision. The reminder included a routine disclosure form Preston had signed. One box stopped her. It asked whether any principal of the bidder had an immediate family relationship with an Aurelia executive that required conflict review. Preston had marked no. Caroline read it twice. They were still legally married. He knew it. His own lawyers knew it. The omission did not prove a crime, and Caroline refused to pretend it did. But it did tell her something painful about the story Preston had been telling other people, that their marriage was already over, that she was irrelevant, and that her position could somehow be treated as invisible whenever it benefited him. That same evening, a calendar notification appeared from the flight operations team. Caroline was scheduled to join Aurelia Flight 701 as part of a planned service review before Aurelia's new London route launch. Preston's name appeared on the passenger manifest only because senior executives were required to review potential conflicts with bidders during the evaluation period. Beside his name was Vanessa Locke. Caroline sat very still. She did not cancel his ticket. She did not change his seat. She did not call Vanessa. She forwarded the disclosure form to Aurelia's general counsel with one sentence. Please keep me recused and let the independent committee handle this. Then she called her obstetrician, confirmed that her uncomplicated pregnancy remained cleared for travel, packed compression socks and a bottle of water, and went home early. The marriage would be addressed as a marriage. The company would be protected as a company. She refused to use one to punish the other. Outside her office windows, aircraft lifted into the night in careful sequence. Caroline understood something Preston had forgotten. Authority was not permission to get even. It was the obligation to know where your power had to stop. Sometimes justice didn't arrive with anger. Sometimes it arrived exactly on schedule. Preston Caldwell stared at Caroline as if the entire aircraft had shifted beneath him. Vanessa's smile disappeared first. Preston's took a few seconds longer. Caroline did not walk toward them. She greeted the chief purser, thanked the gate team for coordinating her arrival within the scheduled final boarding window, and moved to the suite assigned to her by operations. That choice unsettled Preston more than a scene would have. He had expected jealousy. He understood jealousy. He knew how to defend himself against tears, anger, accusations, even threats. What he did not understand was a wife who saw him sitting beside another woman wearing a bracelet he had just fastened around her wrist and chose not to make the cabin responsible for their marriage. Vanessa leaned toward him. You said she worked around aviation. I thought she did. You thought. Preston looked across the aisle. Caroline was speaking quietly with the chief purser about a service report. No one was bowing. No one was applauding on command. The respect around her was more ordinary than that, and therefore more convincing. Employees spoke to her the way people speak to someone who remembers what their work cost them. A few minutes later, Daniel Cho, Aurelia's chief operating officer, stopped by Caroline's suite. The independent hotel committee meets tomorrow at 10 London time, he said. Caroline lowered her voice. I remain recused. Completely. And Preston's disclosure? Counsel asked him to correct it before the committee proceeds. Nothing more has been decided. Good. Preston heard only pieces, but enough to feel his stomach tighten. The airport hotel proposal mattered to Caldwell Property Group. It was not his biggest project, but it was his most visible European expansion. He had assumed marriage to Caroline would be, at worst, a harmless detail. In private, he had even joked to Vanessa that people at Aurelia would know which way the wind blows. Now the phrase sounded ugly. He released his seat belt while the aircraft was still at the gate and crossed the aisle. Caroline. She looked up. We need to talk. We do, she said. Not here. His voice dropped. About the bid. Her expression changed, not with anger, but disappointment. That is exactly why we will not discuss it. I'm your husband. Yes. That has to count for something. It counts for a great deal in my personal life. She closed the folder in front of her. It counts for nothing in an independent procurement review. He glanced toward Vanessa, then back to Caroline. You could clear this up. I already did. I recused myself. He stared at her. Caroline continued. Your company will be evaluated by people who do not report the result to me for approval. If your disclosure needs correction, your counsel can correct it. If the proposal is strong, it can compete on the merits. If it isn't, being married to me will not rescue it. The firmness in her voice was not theatrical. It was the same tone she used when a decision had already been separated from emotion. Preston's jaw tightened. So you're going to punish me by pretending you have no influence? No, Caroline said. I'm protecting both companies by refusing to use it. The boarding door closed. The captain welcomed passengers and reminded everyone to take their seats. Preston returned to Vanessa without another word. For the first time that evening, Vanessa looked less impressed by his certainty. You told me the airline people would take care of your project. Preston stared at the bracelet on her wrist. I was wrong, he said. The cabin door closed at the scheduled time, and Aurelia Flight 701 pushed back from the gate. Caroline settled into her review without looking across the aisle again. The boundary she had drawn around the hotel proposal applied to her as much as it did to Preston. The marriage could be painful, but the procurement process would stay independent. Once Aurelia Flight 701 reached cruising altitude, the cabin settled into the quiet rhythm of an overnight crossing. Caroline drank water instead of champagne, loosened her shoes, and followed the travel plan she and her doctor had discussed. Move regularly when the seatbelt sign was off, stay hydrated, and rest when she could. Her pregnancy was uncomplicated, but she did not treat that as permission to be careless. The executive review itself was intentionally unglamorous. She spoke with flight attendants about meal timing, asked the purser whether the new service carts created congestion, and listened when a crew member explained that the revised galley layout made it harder to reach certain supplies during a full cabin service. She wrote the concern down. Preston watched all of it. During a quiet service interval, the chief purser relayed a note from the flight deck about the new boarding process. Operationally, the captain had reported no problem. The recurring complaint was simpler. Forward galley storage became too tight when the cabin was full. Caroline wrote it beside the same concern she had already heard from a flight attendant. Then I want product operations to look at it after this trip. If the cabin crew and flight deck are describing the same friction, it deserves attention. The captain will include it in the debrief, the purser said. Caroline thanked her and returned to the service report. Preston watched the exchange. Her authority was visible not in taking over other people's jobs, but in listening closely enough to know which problems belonged on her desk. Vanessa, growing restless, whispered, "This is what she does all night? Talks about carts and schedules." Preston almost defended Caroline before catching himself. "She runs an airline," he said. Vanessa looked at him. "You really didn't know?" He had no good answer. Later, the purser quietly asked Caroline if she would mind speaking with a 68-year-old passenger named Margaret Ellis. Margaret's husband had worked 34 years as an Aurelia mechanic and had died the previous winter. She was taking the London trip they had postponed twice during his illness. Caroline went to her seat. Margaret showed her a faded photograph of a much younger man standing beside an aircraft with grease on his coveralls. "He never cared whether anyone knew his name," she said. "He just wanted every plane he touched to come home." Caroline's eyes softened. Then he understood the job better than most executives ever will. Margaret laughed through tears. "He would have liked you." The conversation lasted 10 minutes. There was no camera, no applause. Caroline returned to her seat with the photograph's image still in her mind. Preston had heard enough to remember the early years of his own marriage. Caroline used to ask about his father, his employees, his worries. She had sat through dinners while he talked about financing problems and tenants and zoning hearings. When she spoke about work, he had usually checked his phone. He had not been deceived by a secretive wife. He had been inattentive. That realization was harder to dismiss than any public accusation. Near midnight, Preston finally asked a flight attendant whether Caroline was awake. The attendant checked before leading him across the aisle. Caroline closed the report on her lap. 5 minutes. He sat in the visitor seat facing her. For the first time all evening, he looked like a man rather than a performance. "I was going to tell you about Vanessa," he began. Caroline waited. "We've been separated emotionally for months. That is not the same as being separated honestly." He flinched. "I know. Does she know we're still married?" "Yes." "Does she know I am pregnant with your daughter?" Vanessa had asked about the baby before departure. Caroline already knew the answer, but she needed to hear what he chose to say. "Yes." Caroline nodded once. "Then this isn't a misunderstanding." "No." The words seemed to take something out of him. He tried again. "I thought you didn't need me anymore." Caroline's expression remained steady. "Need is not the standard for fidelity." "I felt invisible." "So did I." That stopped him. Caroline rested a hand over her pregnancy. "I asked you to attend one prenatal appointment in June. You sent your assistant. I asked you to have dinner with me after the anatomy scan. You said a client was in town. I asked you whether we were still building the same life. You told me I was being emotional." Preston stared at the carpet. "I can admit I was a bad husband," he said. "This isn't a negotiation where an admission earns a discount." He almost smiled at the familiarity of her precision, then realized she wasn't joking. "What happens now?" Personally, we speak with our lawyers after we return. We work out a respectful separation. We protect our daughter from becoming a weapon. And the hotel bid. Caroline's answer came immediately. You stop asking me. He nodded. She continued. I sent the disclosure issue to counsel before boarding. The independent committee may allow a correction. It may pause the review. It may reject your proposal for reasons that have nothing to do with me. I will not know until the process is complete. Could you still influence it if you wanted to? Caroline considered him for a moment. I could try, she said. And the fact that I could is exactly why I won't. Preston finally understood that the recusal was not a performance. It was a limit she had chosen before she knew how personally painful the conflict would become. For perhaps the first time in their marriage, Preston understood that restraint could require more strength than control. He stood to leave, then paused. The bracelet came from our joint household account. Caroline's face tightened slightly. I should not have done that, he said. I'll reimburse the account tomorrow. Document it through counsel. Of course. He returned to Vanessa. She had removed the bracelet and placed it in its box. What happened? She asked. My wife refused to save me from a problem I created. Vanessa studied him. That's not what you told me marriage to her was like. What did I tell you? That she was dependent on you. That she lived quietly because you paid for everything. That the airline people liked you. Preston looked across the cabin at Caroline, who was now making a note about an employee's suggestion. I told myself a lot of things, he said. Vanessa closed the box. Then maybe you should start checking which ones are true. She turned toward the window. The conversation ended without raised voices. Vanessa turned toward the window. Preston remained still beside her, and Caroline continued her work across the aisle. For the rest of the crossing, all three had to sit with choices that first class could not make more comfortable. At 5:40 a.m. London time, Aurelia Flight 701 began its descent through a pale gray morning. The captain announced that they would be on the ground shortly, and the cabin crew prepared for arrival. Caroline fastened her seat belt and watched clouds slide past the window. The baby moved beneath her hand. Across the aisle, Preston looked exhausted. Vanessa had stopped wearing the bracelet. After landing, passengers filed into the jet bridge. Caroline remained behind for a brief crew debrief. She thanked the captain and specifically asked the purser to send the galley layout concerned to product operations. Only after the crew discussion ended did she step into the private arrivals lounge, where Aurelia's general counsel, Melissa Grant, waited with Daniel Cho and an open tablet. The procurement committee has paused Caldwell Property Group's hotel proposal for 48 hours, Melissa said. They want a corrected related party disclosure and confirmation that you remain fully recused. Send them whatever they need from my office, Caroline replied. No commentary on the merits. Understood. Preston entered the lounge 10 minutes later at his lawyer's request. Vanessa had continued through immigration alone. Caroline's personal attorney joined by secure video from New York. The tone was calm, administrative, almost painfully ordinary. Preston's lawyer began. My client will amend the disclosure today. Melissa nodded. The committee will decide what weight, if any, to give the omission. Ms. Whitmore will not participate. The lawyers kept the discussion narrow. The disclosure needed to be corrected. The committee would decide what weight to give the omission, and Caroline would remain outside the merits of the bid. Then the business lawyers left the call. Caroline's personal attorney remained. Preston rubbed both hands over his face. This is really happening. Caroline knew what he meant. Yes. Caroline had also asked her personal attorney to prepare for a private separation discussion once everyone returned to New York. She wanted the marriage handled away from passengers, employees, and business negotiations. I want a process that is private, she said. I don't want our child reading someday that her parents turned her beginning into public entertainment. Preston's eyes filled, though he did not look away. I agree. I want both of us advised independently. Yes. I want parenting decisions separated from money. Yes. And I want you to stop telling people our marriage ended before you were willing to say that to me. He swallowed. Yes. For the first time, Caroline believed the answer. Not because she trusted him again. Trust would not return because a man finally became quiet. But because he seemed to understand that the next chapter would not be decided by charm. An hour later, the procurement committee emailed both sides. Caldwell Property Group could remain in the process after correcting its disclosure, but Caroline's recusal would be expanded and documented. The proposal would be judged with the other bids. Preston stared at the message. "You didn't have them throw us out," he said. "No, why?" "Because if your company loses, it should lose fairly. If it wins, it should win fairly." That answer hurt more than revenge would have. It reminded him that Caroline had never needed to become cruel in order to become finished. The weeks after London were quieter than the headlines Preston had once imagined for himself. The flight itself passed into memory mostly as an unusual CEO sighting and a story a few passengers told friends about a very surprised husband. The people who mattered to Caroline, the crew, the committee, and her family, kept the private details private. Caldwell Property Group corrected its disclosure. The independent hotel committee later ranked its proposal second. Another bidder won on price, staffing commitments, and construction guarantees. Preston could not blame Caroline, because the scoring record showed exactly why he had lost. That transparency became its own consequence. He had spent years believing powerful relationships were valuable because they changed outcomes. Caroline showed him that the most honorable use of a powerful relationship was sometimes to prevent it from changing anything. Their separation moved through lawyers and mediation. The joint household account was reconciled. Preston reimbursed the bracelet and travel expenses he had charged there, not because a judge had declared them stolen, but because he agreed they had been personal spending that should not have been shared. Vanessa returned the bracelet to Preston through his office. Her note was brief. "I knew you were married. I didn't know how much of your story about her was invented. I need to own my part and leave the rest to you." Caroline read the note only because Preston's lawyer disclosed the returned property during the accounting. She felt no victory. At 34 weeks, she stopped long-haul travel on the advice of her medical team and shifted to work closer to home. Aurelia continued without drama. That, to her, was proof of good leadership. A company should not wobble because its CEO needed rest. Preston began attending prenatal appointments when Caroline invited him. The first time, he arrived 20 minutes early and sat alone in the waiting room holding a notebook. He did not ask about the hotel bid. He did not ask whether she missed him. He asked the doctor what he should know about supporting a newborn. Caroline noticed. She did not confuse improvement with reconciliation, but she allowed herself to recognize effort without promising a reward. Their daughter, Sophie, was born on a rainy Thursday morning in Manhattan. Preston waited outside the room until Caroline's sister told him she wanted him to come in. He approached the bed slowly. Sophie was tiny, furious, and perfect. Preston cried before he touched her. Caroline watched him whisper, "Hi, I'm your dad." Something inside her softened, not toward the marriage they had lost, but toward the possibility that the three of them could still build a family in a different shape. "You can love her without owning the room," Caroline said quietly. Preston nodded through tears. "I'm learning." This time, she believed that too. 9 months after Aurelia Flight 701, Caroline stood inside Aurelia Atlantic's new employee training center with Sophie asleep against her shoulder. The opening ceremony was deliberately small. Mechanics, gate agents, pilots, customer service representatives, flight attendants, dispatchers, and cleaners filled the room. Their names, not the executives, were printed across the wall behind the stage. Caroline had spent the previous months rebuilding two things at once: her private life and her confidence that boundaries could be compassionate. The divorce had been finalized without a public battle. Neither spouse won the other person's life. Their lawyers documented property, support, and parenting arrangements under the law that applied to them. Caroline kept her interests in Aurelia. Preston kept Caldwell Property Group. Shared assets were resolved through agreement. The details remained private. More important, Sophie had two parents who had stopped using silence as a substitute for honesty. Preston's company remained successful, though the failed airport hotel bid forced him to rethink how casually he had treated conflicts and disclosures. He hired a new general counsel, strengthened internal review procedures, and, after considerable resistance, started seeing a therapist who asked questions no investor ever had. Vanessa moved to California and returned to her own career. She did not become a public villain. Caroline had no interest in reducing another woman to the worst decision she had made. At the training center opening, Preston stood in the back holding a diaper bag. He had asked before attending. That detail mattered. After the speeches, he approached Caroline. "May I take her for a minute?" Caroline smiled and transferred the sleeping baby into his arms. Sophie opened one eye, considered him, then went back to sleep. Preston laughed softly. She has your judgment. Let's hope she has better timing. For a moment, they were simply two tired parents standing beside a window overlooking the runway. I used to think first class meant you had arrived, Preston said. Caroline looked at the employees gathered below. And now I think arriving is easier than becoming someone worth sitting beside. She studied him. Months earlier, the line would have sounded polished. Today it sounded earned. Caroline did not offer reconciliation. He did not ask for it. Some endings were not about putting a marriage back together. They were about ending the lie that only one shape of family counted as success. A training aircraft taxied past the glass. A group of young pilots waved toward the building. Caroline lifted Sophie's tiny hand and waved back. Years later, Caroline would remember the flight less for Preston's expression than for the decision she made afterward. She would not let betrayal decide what kind of leader, mother, or former wife she became. She kept the airline's process clean, kept Sophie's childhood away from public spectacle, and built a co-parenting relationship that required truth instead of appearances. Preston never recovered the marriage. What he gained, slowly, was the chance to become a more reliable father because he finally stopped treating accountability as humiliation. Caroline looked through the training center glass as another aircraft lifted into the afternoon sky, Sophie warm against her shoulder. For the first time in a long time, the future did not feel like something she needed to control. It felt like something she could meet with clear eyes.